Hey friends, so this is a different sort of episode from our normal format. Basically, I want to recommend a book to you and then invite you to listen to a conversation between that book's author and my friend Christine Sine. The book is called The God of Wild Places by a chap named Tony Jones, and I hope you'll consider giving it a read. Now, I'll be honest, the book was not a lot of fun to read. In fact, even now, as I think back to the ways that Tony Jones' writing affected me, I feel a little heaviness in my heart. That is, I think, because it's one of the more achingly honest books I've ever read. Basically, in this book, Tony recounts the story of his life thus far, and in large part, it's a story about failure. Failure as a pastor, failure as a husband, failure as a father. But even though he talks about his own failures, he does it in a way that's intensely relatable by any reader who's also known the pain of failure. For me, even as I read his gut-honest accounts of self-doubt and hubris, I was entirely present to my own brokenness, past and present. All to say, if you have the courage to engage this book honestly, it's probably going to hurt a little bit. But I mean that in the best way, because the upside of that dynamic of empathy is that readers also get to vicariously experience the moments of grace, of peace, of forgiveness and redemption that Tony experiences. And as is the case for so many of us, it's in nature that he finds his healing, and it's in the wild places that he rediscovers God. There are other things about The God of Wild Places that make it an uncomfortable read. For one thing, Tony Jones is a hunter. To put it bluntly, killing things for food, not sport in his case, is one of the ways that he engages nature and in a way experiences God. I'll be honest, as someone who's intentionally not a hunter, there were several times throughout the book that I was tempted to quit reading. It was that uncomfortable. Still, I managed to stay present to some of his more difficult hunting stories, like when he looks into the eyes of a deer that he's wounded and later has to kill with a second shot. Or when he explains in artistic detail just how one removes the entrails and skin of a pheasant. But because I chose to stay with him, it was these visceral encounters that were on some level encounters with aspects of reality that I otherwise work hard to ignore. What I mean is somehow these accounts of blood and bone and meat made me more receptive to profound truths about life and death. My words here in no way do justice to the power of Tony's words, so let me just read a bit of his words about why he hunts. "We've sequestered death," he writes, "pushed it off to arm's length. We leave it to the ambulance drivers and doctors and nurses and morticians. Hunting has changed that for me in a way that religion never did. Deciding with my brothers and mother to remove life support and let my father die was not like wringing the neck of a duck or firing a bullet through the lungs of a white-tailed deer, but it wasn't totally unlike it either. Because as well as reflecting on the inevitability of my own death, I have made the conscious choice to cause death. Anyone who eats meat causes death, but it's usually outsourced to people who work at kill plants. I've chosen to actively participate in the death of my fellow creatures, to end their lives and to take their flesh to my body as food." You know, more than Tony's stories of hunting, it's these deeper themes of death and dying that made me most uncomfortable. And I mean uncomfortable in a way that we know that something painful can also be good for us. In fact, death is a subject that Tony revisits throughout the book. The death of various dogs that were his companions over the course of years, for example, or the painfully undignified death of his father, or the loss of a friend to the ravages of cancer. Perhaps most importantly, Tony lets us into his very personal musings about his own eventual death and the fear that it evokes in him, and by association in us, his readers. His point in all that talk of mortality, though, is to face squarely the fact that we are creatures, that we ourselves are an integral part of nature, and like every part of nature, we're born to eventually die. His point, though, is to get his readers to a really important proposition that maybe it's better to live in a more honest, authentic way by learning to live with an awareness of death and by accepting the fact that to dust will inevitably return. Let me conclude my recommendation of the book by telling you a moment in my reading, which I surprised myself. In between chapters 5 and 6, there's an unremarkable black and white photograph of a man that I assumed to be Tony Jones, bundled up against the cold and looking up at the sky. As soon as I turned to that page and saw that photo, I said out loud and without thinking, "I love you." It was a strange moment, and talking to books is not something I usually do. But in that moment, what I really meant, I think, was to express deep gratitude for the gift of his story that he was offering me. In that moment, I loved him for his vulnerability and for the vulnerability that he was evoking in me by being so gut-wrenchingly honest. I loved him too because in his poetic and deeply observant prose, he was giving words to my own quiet struggles with feeling distant from church community, struggles with vocational significance, struggles with not always feeling like a good parent to my daughter, struggles even with knowing how to relate to God when my old faith practices seem not to serve any longer. To read about the ways in which Tony Jones wrestled with these issues was to realize that I was not alone. Finally, I want to say I recommend the book without reservation. And I know that some of you are thinking, wow, after a cheery review like that, why would I want to subject myself to this book? Others of you, though, probably resonate with what little I've been able to tell you, and perhaps you're open to giving this book a chance. Fortunately, you don't have to decide on the basis of my opinion alone. What follows in this episode is an excerpt of a conversation between Christine Sine, my friend and occasional podcast host, and the book's author, Tony Jones.
In your book, The God of Wild Places, Rediscovering the Divine in the Untamed Outdoors. And I found it very moving. You know, I laughed.
Thank you.
I cried as I read it. But you know, I am particularly intrigued by your journey from church to wilderness as a place to interact with God. I mean, like you, I am attracted to the outdoors. I mean, my husband calls me the garden queen because I love to garden. I love to do, get out in nature. It doesn't matter what it is. And I just wanted, and in fact, probably 10 years or more ago now, I started asking people what makes you feel close to God. And I would say that 80% of them said something about nature. Rarely did people mention church. And I think that, now I wouldn't be surprised if it's even more, if it's even higher from that perspective. But it's, and I just wanted to read a quote from your book here. Where you say, most of us don't quit church in a huff, storming out mid-sermon, vowing never to return. Instead, we slide away, slowly attending less and less often until one day we're forced to admit, I don't go to church anymore. These days, us non-church goers are the fastest growing segment of the American religious landscape. Maybe not coincidentally, the trend line of Americans' participation in outdoor activities is headed in the opposite direction, growing significantly over the past 15 years, which obviously is something that both of us have discovered. But being more specific, what are some of the ways in which you've connected to God in nature?
Yeah, I think the part of the reason for me that I felt pulled to the outdoors in the same way I felt pulled to the church when I was a kid, and then pulled to the outdoors as an adult, is because my life was not clean and neat. Like and the church world that I came from, the Reformed tradition of Congregationalism, was very regularized, a very specific liturgy that was done the same every week. The ministers, we wore black Geneva gowns. We preached 23-minute sermons. I didn't come from a hand-raising Pentecostal, like freewheeling kind of experience of Christianity. I came from a very regularized patterned version of Christianity. And yet my life, my internal life, as I've already said, was a mess. It was not regular. It was not at right angles. It did not, everything did not fit perfectly together. Things did not happen in 23 minutes, you know?
Yes.
And when I went out into the wilderness, and yeah, I like you, I garden. I remember seeing your gardens when we were there in 2008. And I looking out my back door at 4 big raised garden beds. I've planted one. I kind of stagger the planting so we don't get all of our veggies the same week, you know.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that. I love the mess of it. I love, and I guess one of the big, and then as you know, I hunt a lot and I fish, but primarily I hunt, and I spend a lot of time in wild places hunting. Being more involved in the food that I eat, whether it's through gardening or through hunting, and getting my hands in the hummus. Look, whether it's our garden or whether it's field dressing a deer that I've just shot, my hands are in death. Because the hummus in my garden is all composting dead material. It used to be living, now it's dead, and then it's going to become living again.
Oh, the whole process of composting is just, to me, it was one of those incredible revelations of God to me. You know, firstly, how God can take the waste in our lives and make it into what a gardener calls black gold. But secondly, as you say, that introduction, that important introduction to the cycle of life. And of course, you do bring it in different ways. You know, I'm not a hunter, and I have never considered hunting as part of, my exposure to the outdoors. And I did struggle with it a little bit. But again, but in your chapter 4 on companions, I just want to read a little bit out of this. And you're already kind of talking a little bit about that, but just to kind of, be a little more clear. Care for the rest of creation beyond our own species is a mark of our cultural evolution. Few of us think of the created order as a hierarchical chain these days. A web is a more apt metaphor. We are woven into a fabric of creation that includes everything from the largest mammal to the smallest cell. Everything in the fabric is interconnected to everything else. This is the hunter's paradox. I sing a paean to one animal, my dog, my companion, while I'm out to kill another, my prey. Why does one sleep next to my bed and the other wind up on my grill? And why do I get to decide their respective fates? Do you want to fill that out a bit for me?
Well, I mean, it's frankly the paradox of anybody who eats meat, but I think even vegetarians are not off the hook, because human beings, we're the most invasive species this planet has ever seen, and we extirpate critters.
Yes.
Where you're sitting in your house and where I'm sitting in my house 200 years ago, these were woods, and it was abounding with little critters, rabbits and mice and microbes and everything in between. And they're all gone now because we've plowed it flat and poured concrete foundations and built our own houses so that we can live and thrive in comfort. And so even if everybody on my block was a vegetarian, we'd still have pushed out a lot of critters and extirpated them from this environment. So it's just what human beings do. Whether we eat meat or not eat meat, we're responsible for the death of a lot of animals. And all I'm trying to do as a human being and as a thinker and a theologian is to try to come to terms with that and realize that I do make these relatively arbitrary decisions, that I'm not going to hunt and eat my dog, but I am going to hunt and eat a white-tailed deer, and I get that makes some people uncomfortable, but part of my journey has been I just want to be more honest about the life I live. And I feel like when I was in ministry, I wasn't totally honest because I was preaching peace and standing up in a pulpit and acting like I had everything together. But my personal life was not clean and neat. It was messy. And I felt dishonest. I knew I was being dishonest about it. And now I just want to be honest about the fact that I eat animal. I'm a carnivore. I eat meat. So I'm going to be honest about that. It might make my readers uncomfortable. I appreciate that you say it made you somewhat uncomfortable. You struggled with it. I think a lot of people do. But I also think we do a great disservice to the animals we eat when we buy them in a grocery store and never think about their death.
Oh, yeah.
Because our ancestors, all of whom ate meat, were deeply involved in the death of the animals they ate. You know,
yes.
whether they were farmers 100 or 200 years ago, or whether they were hunters and gatherers 25,000 years ago, they were deeply involved in the death of the animals they ate. And I don't think they took it for granted because they were involved in it. And I think we do take it for granted, most of us, because we buy it at the grocery store wrapped in cellophane. And frankly, most of all that is denuded of blood. And as you and I both know, there's a lot of blood in the Bible. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And we make sure I don't want to see any blood on that boneless, skinless chicken breast I buy at the grocery store. But man, that chicken bled before it was wrapped up in cellophane.
Well, when I was a kid, we used to keep chickens, and I do remember, kind of slaughtering the chickens, and also have been very much aware of the process and have no objection to it from that perspective. I think, and as I read your book, I mean, part of what I was really pleased to see was that you hunt and then eat what you hunt, whereas, I think the kind of hunting I really struggle with, there's the kind of hunting where people, kind of devastate and have in the past, of course, devastated and sometimes brought to extinction species because they've overhunted them. And, I don't know whether you have anything to say to that, that aspect of it.
Well, I don't trophy hunt. I mean, there are people who trophy hunt and just try to shoot the biggest, the animal with the biggest rack so that they can hang the head on.
The most beautiful animal, yes.
Yeah, the animal with the biggest rack on and hang it on the wall. That's not how I hunt. But in the United States, actually, we are so much. It's called the North American Conservation Model. And basically what we did is in the early 20th century, we outlawed market hunting. And as a result, we still have wild animals on this continent.
Mm-hmm.
And in Europe, there's virtually none. There's virtually no deer. There's no more elk. I mean, there's little herds and little places that are protected. But there's Europe. I mean, there's like no public land to hunt. Everything is owned. You cannot, it's not even allowed to hunt. And as there's no hunting in Europe. People tell me that because the gun laws and things like that. And I get it. I mean, the guns are another part of hunting that makes people uncomfortable. But the truth is, guns or no guns, there's no hunting in Europe because there's no public land and there's virtually no wild populations left because they were hunted to extinction. And in the U.S., to our credit, starting with people like Theodore Roosevelt, we hit the brakes hard on that before obviously we almost totally extirpated the bison, but that was one of the species that after that happened, a lot of American hunters and who led the conservation movement said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not
thank
going
goodness.
to.
Yes.
Yes. Thank goodness. We're not going to wipe species out anymore. So, I know what you're saying, but I will say on behalf of hunters, and I have a lot of hunters who are like me, pretty progressive, actually, politically and theologically progressive people. Hunters, for the most part, with some exceptions, are great conservationists and care a lot about wild land. I mean, it was just even what you said at the top of the interview about the people you talk to and how 80% of them find God in nature. Isn't it ironic, though, that we have less and less nature every year, and that we keep we're just mowing we're mowing down forests, we're building more malls and parking lots. It's a sad irony that as organized religion is dying before us and people are going to need wild places as spiritual escape, that we're going to have less and less of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh no, it's true. And I'm not saying I'm against hunting, because I think that allowing people to do that, I think, is a good idea in moderation. I think it's just because you can look back and see the devastation and the people that still want to be able to hunt with machine guns, and I mean, those kinds of fringe things, I know, that give hunting a bad name. And because I would, in many ways, agree with your perspective completely. I mean, one of the fortunate things about the US and also Australia, where I come from, is that because white settlement came so much later in the picture, we kind of woke up to ourselves a little more quickly in terms of the need for wild places, whereas Europe, of course, had thousands of years of moving in that direction. And of course, the kings and their entourages were well known for totally exterminating parks of deer and things like that, which, is anyway.
And I just want to say a little shout out to Australia that among the best meat I've ever eaten is when Fuzz Kiddo cooked me kangaroo.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. Kangaroo meat is good.
Really good.
And it's a shame that it's not more wildly eaten, because Australia could do with getting rid of a few kangaroos.
That's what I've heard. This is another, it's the same with white-tailed deer. Because we've extirpated almost all the predators of white-tailed deer, primarily wolves. The wolf population is a tiny fraction of what it was in North America. And as a result, wild deer populations have exploded, and that means more white-tailed deer illness. They spread these illnesses like chronic wasting disease. And so hunters actually help manage the populations of some of these prey species that don't have predators anymore, because we've pushed out the predators, Yeah.
Oh, I was just at a conference, where they were talking about how one of the best things we can do to reestablish the balance is to bring back in the apex predators. Yes. And how, of course, the situation that started in Yellowstone with the wolves, and how it just, kind of brought renewal at every level of the ecosystems. And I think that it's true, that we've often been very short-sighted in our way of looking at things, and learning a respect for all of the creatures, not just the pretty ones, not just the ones that we think aren't going to damage us or, hurt us if we get too close, but learning to respect the creation as it is, I think, is a very important part of what we need to do. And of course, you do talk a bit about that and some of the risks that you've gone through, but it's just fascinating to me to see the direction that you've gone, because it's a different direction from that which a lot of other people that find God in the wild have gone into, and that's part of what I find fascinating. Are there any, or what are the lessons that you've learned would you like to share with our readers? And anything else, any quotes you might want to give out of your book, The God of Wild Places, or lessons that you've learned as you wrote it?
Yeah, well, from having read the book that death is a big theme in the book. And not only death of my first marriage and kind of the spiritual death that ensued, but I write about the death, kind of the metaphorical death of a forest when a tornado ripped through a forest of our family land and knocked down all these gorgeous, huge, hundreds-year-old white pine trees and the scraggly aspen that grew up in their place. And then I'd write about the death of my father and coming to terms with that. So I just think a big thing for me, Christine, in the outdoors has been facing my own mortality, which honestly, as somebody who grew up Christian, with so much emphasis on going to heaven when you die, and your next life will be so much better than this life. That was the version of Christianity I grew up in. It was very otherworldly focused. And that I've been disabused of that notion, not only because I just theologically really have a hard time with it now, but also because there is another strain of Christianity. So a quote from the book that you might like, that you might remember is from a sign that hangs over the monastery on Mount Athos that says, "If you die before you die, then you won't die when you die," which is a funny, paradoxical kind of statement, but it's in line with the Stoic idea of memento mori, remember your mortality, keep your death always before you, and you will live a better life. You will love people better. You'll treat others better. You'll be better to this earth if you keep your death in front of you at all times. I'm not any longer focused on what happens after I die. I'm focused on what I can do now, here and now, and live the best life I can, and to keep my own mortality front and center at all times.
This has been a conversation between Christine Sine, author, blogger, and podcaster at God's Space Light, and Tony Jones, author of a new book called The God of Wild Places. For more information about both, please go to the show notes for this episode. And if you know someone who would benefit from hearing this episode, either in audio or video format, please do forward a link to them. The Earth Keepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast, or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website, or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. James Amidon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Meggerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earth Keepers podcast.